Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Let's turn, if we may, to Brexit.
Yeah.
How do you think the general election result has changed the negotiating position Britain should take for Brexit?
Well, I think the Prime Minister's got us into a complete mess. She's got no mandate here and she's got no authority abroad, and the negotiations start tomorrow. And things have to change. Her approach so far has alienated our allies in Europe. It's weakened our position with the EU.
Okay.
And it's actually got us into the worst possible starting position.
But you see, what people say to me is that actually, when you look at it, Labour's position on Brexit is identical to Theresa May's position. So let me test that, if I may, with some yes or no questions, if I can.
Yes.
First of all, do you accept that we are leaving the EU, come what may?
Yes, we've been clear about that from the absolute start.
OK, second, are you against a second referendum?
A second referendum cannot take place until after we've left the EU, and therefore it's not viable.
So that's not viable. OK, third question. Are there any circumstances in which you think Britain should stay inside the single market?
Well, so far as the single market is concerned, our manifesto is clear. We want to retain the benefits of the single market and the customs union. Formal membership, full membership, is only available to EU member states. And that's why there's all the discussion about what sort of model that gets us close to membership. So that sounds to me like a no, we cannot stay inside the single market. Not in an unreformed, unchanged way, because you have to be a full EU member, and that's not consistent.
You see, you're not quite giving me a clear answer on that. You think the single market could be changed or reformed in a way that allows us to stay inside. Is that right?
I think the mistake we're all making here is to put the model before the outcome. What we want is tariff-free access to the single market, no customs duties that make it more difficult for people to trade in the future. That's what really matters. And the flip side of that, from the EU point of view, is how do we make sure there's a level playing field? How do we make sure that regulations apply across the board? That's what we're talking about. It's the outcome, and getting in the weeds of the model, actually, I think, loses the focus on the outcome.
I understand that. I'm going to have one last go, because the Labour position, if I put it gently, is clear as mud on the single market. Well, let me just say, John McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn have both said we're out of the single market. That's it. We can't stay inside the single market.
Andrew, you can only be a full member of the single market if you're an EU member, and therefore it is obvious that we're looking at something else. The question is, do we leave options on the table? And I've said repeatedly, yes, leave options on the table.
So
but
what
there
are those
number
options?
of different models.
So what are those options?
Focus on the outcomes, which I've just enumerated.
Yeah, but I'm asking specifically.
You can then, how you get to it, you can either take single market membership and say what needs to change to get us to the position we need to be in, or you can start with a sort of bare agreement and work up. What matters is the outcomes, because what we need is a deal that actually works for our country.
Would you sacrifice control over freedom of movement in order to stay inside the single, or have very good access to the single market?
Well, it's clear that freedom of movement will end when we leave the EU, and therefore the discussion we're having is what model fits with changes to freedom of movement plus the trade that we need.
So you could have some freedom of movement remaining.
Well, I don't understand this notion of some freedom of movement. In the end, immigration comes down to...
You sound like, in a very gentle way, you're saying exactly what Theresa May would say if she was sitting there.
No, Theresa May has taken the wrong approach. The tone and approach is completely wrong. I say we can't have membership because that was decided last year. We can have partnership if we change the tone and approach. We need to be much clearer about the benefits of the single market.
That's tone and words and stuff, but on the actual clear... Well, let me try one other thing. Customs union, in or out?
Well, I think that should be left on the table.
You see?
Well, because...
So we could stay inside the customs union?
Yes.
Well, that is the single biggest difference between you and the Conservative
Well, there's
Party.
also this notion of no deal being a viable deal, which Theresa May and the government have repeatedly said. No deal is what happens if you get to the end of the 2 years and you haven't been able to reach agreement. You're pushed over the cliff. To say I'll jump over the cliff isn't a negotiating stance that makes much sense.
It seems a lifetime ago, but last week I had Jeremy Corbyn sitting where you are, and I asked him about the Great Repeal Bill.
Yes.
And he said, oh, that's history. Are you actually going to vote against the Great Repeal Bill?
Well, the problem with the Great Repeal Bill is how do you entrench rights and freedoms that we currently enjoy? Yeah, but without qualification, without limitation, without sunset clause. So that's where the battle will be.
It takes all those workers' rights that the EU have legislated for and puts them into British law. So I can't see why the Labour Party would be against it.
In principle, we're not against that. The question is, how do we prevent qualification and limitation of that? That's the first thing. The second is, how do we make sure that as time goes by, our standards don't slip below those of, Europe?
One last yes or no. Are you going to oppose the Great Repeal Bill in the House of Commons, yes or no?
We haven't seen it yet. The principle of entrenching EU rights and freedoms is one that we would support.
See, right. All right. Keir Starmer, for now, thank you very much indeed.
Now, will the government's Brexit plans have to change following the election after they failed to get the mandate that Theresa May demanded, leaving them, as we've been hearing, with no Commons majority? Lots of attention is focused on whether Britain's future lies outside what's called the EU's customs union, which makes it easier for firms to trade within the EU, but prevents Britain striking its own free trade deals with other countries. Let's have a listen, first to Labour's shadow Brexit Secretary Keir Starmer, and then the Chancellor Philip Hammond speaking earlier.
Customs union, in or out?
Well, I think that should be left on the table.
You see?
Well, because...
So we could stay inside the customs union?
Yes, we're leaving the EU, and because we're leaving the EU, we will be leaving the single market. And, by the way, we'll be leaving the customs union. The question is not whether we're leaving the customs union. The question is, what do we put in its place in order to deliver the objectives which the Prime Minister set out?
Well, that's what the politicians say. What do people who are familiar with the world of business make of it all? I'm joined by the former Director General of the CBI, at one time Trade Minister, Lord Digby. He's Digby now, Lord Jones, and he's in Oxfordshire. And I'm also joined in the studio by the fund manager, Nicola Horlick. Morning to you both. Morning. Digby, before we get bogged down in what people should or shouldn't do, the government, from a business perspective, this thing, the customs union, what exactly is it and why does it matter to businesses?
Well, the single market and all those people who talk about we must stay in the single market, why don't they say the other words, which is Britain doesn't have control over immigration and Britain's judges don't have control over the law? Those two things come with the single market. The customs union is something where you can actually be within a trading relationship, not as integrated as the single market, but the big problem we will have coming out of the single market, I don't think is tariffs. It's not 10% on this and 5% on that, because that'll hurt Europe. The problem is the bureaucracy, the sheer regulatory burden, the cost, the delay of getting goods and services across borders. So the customs union stops that, Nick.
Crudely, what businesses are worried about...
It stops that.
Is being delayed on the border by paperwork, deliberate paperwork perhaps, in order to try and make it harder for our businesses to do business. That's what the issue is.
Well, that's the biggest part of it. The other part of it, of course, is that you do get this sense of being within something, so that those investors, inward investors from Japan and America and China, who come to Britain for many good reasons, get the advantage of being within this trading relationship. The big downside, there are two big downsides to it. One is that you actually have to pay money for it. I mean, it doesn't come free, there's a cheque to write. And secondly, and this I think is the big one, is all my years at the CBI, all my years as a trade minister, what you find is we are well known for trading around the world openly. We're good quality traders. We don't do the protectionism of America or France. We actually are good at this. It forbids you from going around the world and doing your deal with Singapore or America or China or Brazil or whatever. You have to allow Brussels to do it, and you are forbidden from being part of a global economy. And I think that will be the big stopper.
Thank you for the moment, Digby. Nicola Horlick, in the end, if you could get the advantages of a border that was simple to do business across, wouldn't it make sense, as Digby Jones says, to get out of the customs union and therefore be able to trade around the world freely without waiting for Brussels to do some deal that would take many years to do?
Well, the problem is that striking trade deals takes many, many years, as we've seen. Many examples lately of where the EU has been trying to negotiate something, or the US has been trying to negotiate something, takes years and then sometimes stumbles at the last hurdle. And so the idea that we can suddenly just go and strike our own trade deals is nonsense, in my view. It'll take years. And if we'd be cutting off our nose to spite our face if we shun the EU. There are 500 million people in the EU, including Britain, so it goes down a bit if we come out. But the point is, we are able to trade freely with that bloc currently, with no constraints. If we
so
stay...
you are cheering on Labour's Keir Starmer when he says, yes, we're getting out of the EU, but we might still be able to stay in this thing called the customs union.
Well, as Digby says, if you stay in the customs union, you can't then go and do your own trade deals. So it's a very difficult conundrum.
So, Digby Jones, what we heard from the Chancellor this morning was some suggestion there was a kind of middle position, that yes, we get out of the customs union, but over a period of years, to stop businesses having the worries that you set out, there'd be some sort of transition. Up for that?
What business needs is certainty, boring predictability, and the next couple of years is going to deliver precisely the opposite. And anybody who thinks otherwise is for the birds. So if it was set out as a timetable and everybody knew by this date, by this date, by this date, things will happen, then I'm up for that. What we have to make sure people understand, and this is so important, is that the European Union is a big trading bloc, Nicola is right, but it is only one. And this is Asia's century. It's not Europe's, it's not America's, it's Asia's.
Let me bring Nicola in.
You've got Brussels marching valiantly towards 1970. We need to hitch our wagon to the world, not just to Brussels, although Brussels is very important.
There was a phrase used by a civil servant many, many years ago, I think it was in the 1950s, we don't want to chain ourselves to a corpse, said the civil servant about Europe. I think what Digby Jones is saying to you, Nicola Horlick, is the future is elsewhere.
Well, I mean, the fact is, it is not only a huge area with 500 million people, but it's also a very prosperous area. And you'd have to do an awful lot of trade deals across many, many territories to actually replicate what we currently have, which is free access to a huge trade bloc with no constraints. And that has been beneficial to our economy over the last few years.
What I want to be clear about is you didn't want to leave. I suspect you'd love to reverse it now if you could. But do you think it is possible, yes, to get out, as the people voted for, but to still have the advantages of the customs union?
I think that's very difficult. I mean, I actually think...
You're either in or you're out, you think?
Yeah, I think. And I think if you actually look at what's happened during the election, there's been this huge thing about 80% of people voted for parties that actually wanted Brexit. I don't think that's true. I think if you actually look at what happened, a lot of younger people voted who weren't expected to vote in the election, and they certainly are not in favour of leaving the EU or the single market or the customs union or any of it.
Digby, at the beginning, when you described what the advantages of the customs union were, I think many people watching would think, and therefore the end of your sentence would be, that's why we must stay in. But you're actually in favour of getting out. Why are you willing to take such a risk?
Well, I actually think the negotiations over the next 2 years should be unique. We are the 5th or 6th biggest economy on earth. We ought to have a quality relationship with Europe for all the reasons Nicola has said, and she's right, and at the same time reach out to the world. And it is so achievable, together with Philip Hammond's suggestion of some degree of feathering, over a period of years, because it's in Europe's interests.
I want to end by asking you both.
We need humility and we need less arrogance, but we've got to get there.
Rather briefly, if you would, what's the nightmare? What's the fear if we are not in the customs union, Nicola Horlick?
Well, I believe it's going to be very detrimental to our economy. And also, can I just say one thing? The fact of the matter is that Germany is in the EU. Germany does 7 times as much trade with China than we do. This idea that being in the EU prevents us trading with other countries is nonsense.
Brief last sentence, Digby.
The biggest problem, the German example, is rubbish. I mean, they dominate the EU and they use that as a way of enhancing their competitiveness in China. Just play on a level playing field, Nicola, because that's not true. But what is true, and you are right, is that coming out of the customs union and ploughing our own furrow, done badly, will deny us the access that we've spoken of. Done well, it'll actually have the best of both worlds.
Lord Digby Jones, Nicola Horlick, thank you very much indeed. Still with me, the journalist Steve Richards, Julia Hartley-Brewer and Tom Newton-Dunn. Steve, Brexit, as if it's just a small thing this week.
Yeah,
we've heard from the Chancellor this morning, we've heard also from Andrea Leadsom. Do you detect any shift in government position or still a lively debate about what it might be?
I think tonally we have a shift simply because Philip Hammond now is in a much stronger position than he could have ever dreamed he would be in 10, 12 days ago before the election result. So tonally, we have him now very confidently saying, look, the focus must be on the economy, on having some kind of deal whereby, you know, there aren't bureaucrats blocking the movement of goods and so on. But beyond that, it's not entirely clear how he plans to use this new political muscularity. I think that will become clearer as the talks begin. But at this point, it all still seems fairly vague, actually, Labour's position and the government's as these talks begin tomorrow.
I suppose the key in the end, Julia, is whether people like you who have been rather pro-Brexit smell a rat.
Rather pro-Brexit.
Yeah, well, I was just being generous. Do you, in other words, think, I know what they're up to? They're trying to tear up the referendum result.
Well, I think it's almost irrelevant what the government says and what they're even thinking about doing. What matters is what is on the table. Hence all this nonsense about hard Brexit and soft Brexit. Soft Brexit is, A, not Brexit, and B, not an option. It's not on the table. Guy Verhofstadt did the work of Nigel Farage last week when he said very clearly, look, you know, yes, okay, Britain can remain in the EU, but on worse terms we'll lose our £5 billion rebate.
They may not be hard or soft. They're slow Brexit.
Well,
and even Digby Jones.
No, but no, at the end of
slow.
end of March in 2019, we will be out of the EU. Full stop. That's what happens. So it's a question of transition deals. Yes, that's fine, and questions of other issues. No, the real issue is are the British government, whoever is in power at that time signing that deal, we don't know right now, are they going to obey the will of the people as expressed in the EU referendum, which is out of the single market, no free movement, all that. There is either Brexit or no Brexit. All this nuance, I think, actually is completely irrelevant.
Tom, tomorrow change anything?
Yes, it does. Quite a lot has changed already. There was fascinating, the first compromise the government made on Friday, which was almost unreported on Friday because we had so much else to talk about, Grenfell obviously being the major one, was the government agreed to go by the EU's timetable, which is let's sort out the divorce first, then we'll get on to the trade deal.
They're not going to agree to pay that bill.
They wouldn't agree, we won't write any cheques until we finally get there. But the other thing that, of course, changed is the composition of the Houses of Parliament, or certainly the House of Commons. There is no majority for Theresa May's version of Brexit, call it hard, soft, something else. I think the huge area there's going to be room for manoeuvre on is going to be on immigration. It won't be the customs union. There'll be an argument about what relationship we should have, but it will be to soften up this Theresa May push for hard immigration controls.
Jobs first, which is Philip Hammond's slogan last week, and in his big speech that he's got in the week ahead, in his delayed Mansion House speech, jobs first is a change of the government's position, Steve, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think Tom's absolutely right on immigration. I was told, for example, that the decision to include student numbers in the immigration total was her view and hers alone. Well, I think that will be dropped now because the Cabinet will feel strong enough to assert their different view. Every single member of that Cabinet, I'm told, apart from her, didn't want that. So that is an example of a refocusing. But at the moment, it's not clear where that refocusing ultimately will lead. I think the talks will begin in a sort of messy, blurred way. I speak to some Tory MPs who and this is Tory MPs who are on the Remain side, who wonder whether at the end of it Julia won't get that thing, and we're still in 2019. So everything is sort of
We're not. It's not possible
blurred.
for us to still be in the legal process has begun. We are out of the EU
Sure.
at the end of that
you know,
2-year
there's a
period.
transition which could mean that it feels very like we're still in, even if we're not.
But this is it. All this talk about compromise and nuance. This is between members of the cabinet and what's going on between political parties and within political parties here in the UK. What really matters is what is on the table from the EU and how the British people
at some
react.
stage during these talks, the government is going to have to make a decision. If they don't happen to get the cake and eat it scenario that everyone really wants to, funny old thing, they're going to have to choose, walk away or accept what's on the table. And my bet is they'll accept what's on the table and Brexit will, by
Julie,
nature,
you
be
made clear it
softened.
was about parliamentary arithmetic, and that is the dramatic change, isn't it? We've tended to report this story, all of us, as internal machinations in the Tory party and the Cabinet in particular.
It's what you can get through.
It's what you can get through Parliament now, Steve, isn't it?
But there's another change as well, and it's fundamental. I mean, she did frame this election as a mandate for her version of Brexit. And like Ted Heath, when he called his early election February 74 to get a mandate as to who governs, she didn't get that mandate. So she does begin, I know it's become a cliche, but she does begin this in a much weakened position because she didn't get the mandate she sought.
Well, let's move on to then the Queen's speech that comes up this week, because again, that would be a huge story if it were not for the fire and if it were not for Brexit, because of course, as a government, Tom, without a majority. Andrea Leadsom said to me, oh, we're just delaying next year's Queen's speech. No, don't worry ahead, it's to give MPs more time to discuss. Do you buy that?
Not in the slightest. There will be no second Queen's speech in a year's time, simply because they have no idea whether they'll have the numbers to support it. But also, one Queen's speech in one full year's Parliament, quite frankly, is going to be taken up almost entirely by the Great Reform Bill. All the legislation has to be put in place to make sure we can actually leave the EU in March 2019. So there will be no legislative time left for the remnants left of Theresa May's Tory manifesto, but she feels this desperate need to try. So, for example, I think we'll see a planning bill, a housing bill, so to try and answer the rage expressed at the EU referendum, the greater rage perhaps expressed over austerity at the general election, and one or two other things like that. Other things dead in the water, grammar schools, for example, some of the more Mayist, interventionist policies are now forever gone.
Some people might quite welcome a little bit of an end to the ongoing new legislation about every possible topic, which doesn't ever seem to actually make anyone's lives any better.
We don't yet know the deal, do we, with the DUP?
No.
And now we know some of it will be very focused on Northern Ireland itself. But there is a chance, is there not, that they see themselves as fighting austerity in the UK as a whole, saying you can't do that, we won't vote for that, we won't have this as well.
Well, I mean, you can't just have a set of policies for Northern Ireland to keep the Ulster Unionists on board, which are not applied if they seem rather rosy and benevolent to the rest of the UK.
Well, the Barnett formula requires the same amount of spending. Once you spend a certain amount per person in Northern Ireland, you spend more in Wales and Scotland as well.
That's the Treasury formula that applies to public spending, and so that whatever's spent in England, there are ramifications for other parts of the UK.
They cannot appear to be punitive in Scotland now, because there are Scottish Conservative MPs who would stop that. So, I mean, they are close to impotent. And the only question that will be asked of the Queen's speech as they put it together is, can we get this through? And therefore they will get it through, because they won't put anything in that could be defeated.
A last thought then about the fire, because how much we say these other events are bigger, I have a sense that when Parliament gathers, when the first PMQs happens, the fire will dominate once again. Have ministers done enough, Tom? Have Labour done enough to dissociate themselves from some of the protests? Have they done enough, as it were, to avoid some of the political risks involved?
I think in the short term, finally Number 10 is beginning to do enough. They are throwing everything they've got at it. The Prime Minister seems to be meeting relatives every day now, which is beginning to abate the political crisis. The great mess, though, that will continue is Labour have already managed to turn this into an austerity argument, an anti-austerity argument, and that will live and live.
I think the politicisation of this has actually been appalling. I think actually on both sides. But this is about poor people's lives at the end of the day. But maybe that is political. But the way it's been politicised, I think, completely wrong.
Steve?
I think it raises also huge questions about who is responsible for what. The instinct, because of the prism we're looking at everything at the moment, is to blame Theresa May for the whole lot, something that wouldn't have happened 2 months ago. What about the role of the local authority? What about the invisibility of the local authority afterwards? Which bit of our government is responsible for what is the cause of many, many crises in this country.
But that's an issue across the board. There's a rule by committee and no one actually, the buck doesn't stop with anyone and no one's responsible. And that's why you don't ever get, for instance, these corporate manslaughter
who is accountable for what?
I thought in many ways that for those of us in our line of work, as it were, the most painful question, beyond all the horrible human tragedy, was to hear people say, we don't know who to ask, we don't know who's responsible.
But that was a failure by the local council.
And you put it to Andrea Leadsom, who's in charge? We don't know. And quite frankly, her saying definitively, the Prime Minister, I don't think will reassure too many people.
Tom Newton-Dunn, Julia Hartley-Brown, Steve Richards, thank you very much indeed.